MotoGP is going to be changing forever, and the organisers of MotoGP are trying to make the bikes themselves slower. How come? Well, there's a couple of reasons why, which I'll explain a little bit later on. And while it sounds easy on paper to make them slower, it's actually a little more complicated than you might think. But before we go into all of that, and to help the rest of the video make sense, let me quickly go through what I actually mean by changing. Take a look at this MotoGP bike from the 1950s, or as it was known back then, the 500cc class. And now let's compare it to a modern MotoGP bike from 2024. As you can see, almost everything is different. In fact, the only real similarities are that they both have two wheels, an engine, and a rider. That's pretty much it. There's a huge engineering gap of over 70 years. Engineers are constantly innovating, experimenting, and trying out new things to get an advantage, and ultimately win. So let's add in a bike from every decade since the top class of motorbike racing started, and take a look at each of them in order. You'll notice gradual changes over time. This is the gradual advancement of technologies as the years go on. But every so often, there's a big change of rules. These can be things like new engine specs, new aero, tyres, chassis changes, you name it. And this can lead to some interesting and pretty wacky designs. Now, there's probably been thousands and thousands of changes over the years. So let me give you a quick recap on some of the major changes in MotoGP. 1967 was one of the first major shakeups, as the number of cylinders and gears were limited in the regulations. This was to help with costs, but to also make sure the bikes didn't become too fast. In 1984, a mandatory fuel limit was introduced, meaning bikes had to be more efficient in how they made power, which again stopped them from becoming too fast. 2002 was the first year of what we now know as MotoGP, and the 500cc engines were phased out to make way for 990cc four-stroke engines. This was more to bring MotoGP into the modern era. In 2007, the engines were made smaller and went back down to 800cc engines to help with safety and also to manage how fast the bikes were. But after a pretty unanimously hated few years, the engine size limit increased back to 1000cc, this time with a bore limit of 81mm. Again, to control the power and the speeds. 2017 was a big shake-up, and you start to see aero packages become more common, which has evolved over time into the bikes you see on track now. The aero packages and the 1000cc four-stroke engines were the last two major rule changes in MotoGP. And that brings us to the present day, where we do have a small issue. The bikes are becoming too fast. Because the bikes are so fast and the aero is so advanced, it can actually be quite tricky to overtake. Now, before you start typing frantically away in the comment section, there is still some hugely exciting racing in the modern MotoGP era, but something needs to change. Just to give you some context on how fast these bikes actually are, Brad Binder and Paul Espargaro hold the joint top speed ever recorded in a MotoGP session. They were both recorded at Mugello, and they managed to reach 366.1 kilometers an hour on a bike. It's insanely fast. Now let's take a look back to 2018. The record at the time was 356.5 kilometers an hour, or 221 miles per hour. It doesn't sound like a huge difference, but at that speed, it takes a huge amount of effort to go faster. The overall race speeds of modern MotoGP is also pretty staggering. Have a look at this printout from Assen in 2023. The total time was 40 minutes and 37 seconds. Now look at the total race time just a year later at the same race. In 2024, it was 40 minutes and 7 seconds, 30 seconds faster across a race distance. In a year, the race time dropped by 30 seconds, and they're only going to get faster. So why does something actually need to be changed? Well, a large part of it is safety. MotoGP and bike racing in general is the safest it's ever been. That's thanks to technologies around the track like the barriers, runoffs, as well as the gear riders use. It all adds up to make it as safe as possible. Take a look at the gloves that riders use. The little finger and ring finger are stitched together to reduce the risk of it being broken in a crash. Safety is the most important thing. A secondary benefit of changing everything is potentially making the racing better. By controlling certain changes, it'll limit the amount of technical development that can be done, and with everyone in theory being closer together, the racing should be better overall. Again, that's in theory. So what exactly are they changing for the modern MotoGP rules that come into effect in 2027? Well, there's quite a few big changes, and I'm going to save the most controversial one for last. But the first big change is banning all shapeshifter technology. Yes, it sounds made up, but it's an actual thing. Have a look at these videos here and see if you notice something about the bikes. Might be hard to notice at first, but take a closer look at the height of the bike, both at the front and at the rear. You'll notice the rider can lower the bike. But what's the benefit? Well, it brings the center of gravity lower to the ground to help with acceleration and to stop excessive wheeling. The device at the front is called the whole shot device, and the device at the rear is cleverly named the ride height device. The whole shot device is only used at the start, but regardless, both of these types of technology are being banned. Another big difference is that the aero packages are being restricted, but they aren't being banned completely. Take the front fairing, for example. The maximum width at the moment is 600 millimeters. In 2027, it's being reduced to 550 millimeters. Is that a big difference? Not really, but it will stop some downforce being generated by the front fairing. Now, this next one might seem a little bit strange and might not be a huge benefit at all, but all riders' GPS data will be shared with every other team. They won't be sharing their telemetry, but being able to see where someone is on track at any given moment could potentially help with some things, but it is hard to tell. Personally, I don't think it's going to be too much of a help, but I'm not an engineer, nor am I a professional motorbike rider in MotoGP. So take my opinion with a massive grain of salt. Fuel tanks are going to be smaller as well. They'll be reduced to 20 litres for the main race and 11 litres for the sprint. This actually ties into the other major point of MotoGP by going to 100% non-fossil origin fuels from 2027. Currently they use around 40% non-fossil origin fuels, so it's a pretty big jump. The bikes are going to be lighter as well. The minimum weight is currently 157 kilos and it's being dropped to 153 kilos. Now that might not seem too much of a difference, but trying to get rid of another 4 kilos from the bikes is a pretty staggering difference. These bikes are already at the top level of prototype racing, so they're surely quite close to the limit of how light they can actually be. Although, again, all of the clever engineers in MotoGP will, I'm sure, find a way of getting rid of that extra weight. Now, a recent introduction into MotoGP is the concession system in place for every team, and it was to try and help the teams further down the field catch up with everyone else. The way the concession system works is pretty simple. There's 4 ranks, A, B, C, and D, and depending on how well a manufacturer did for a previous set amount of time dictates what group they're going to be in. A is the best, and D is the worst. From the start of the 2024 season, Ducati were in A, KTM and Aprilia were in category C, and unsurprisingly, Honda and Yamaha were in category D. There's a few perks the lower category manufacturers get, including free engine spec upgrades, more engines themselves, more testing tyres, more wildcards, and so on. When a team starts performing better and they move up the categories, they'll get more restrictions. So, with all of that in mind, it might be a problem if the new regulations come out and Ducati goes from the best manufacturer to the worst. So, in 2027, every manufacturer is being reset to category B, and they'll be assessed midway through the 2027 season. This keeps all manufacturers on a level playing field going into the new regulations. But the biggest change by a country mile is the new engine regulations. Since 2012, MotoGP has been using 1000cc 4-stroke engines, and very little in the way has changed. However, in 2027, engines will be limited to 850cc's, and that's already caused some potential issues. You see, back in 2007, MotoGP went from the popular 990cc engines to 800cc engines. A big part of the reason was safety concerns about the bikes becoming too fast, so the drop in engine size in theory came with a lower top speed, but it didn't actually slow the bikes down. In fact, it made them faster. The 800cc bikes were lighter than the 990cc bikes, and while they were slower in a straight line, they were much faster through the corners. The other problem was how the engines delivered the power, and with all of the era's complex technology, the racing was pretty rubbish. There was an optimal way to ride the bike. Everyone took the same lines, and everyone carried the same amount of corner speed. Literally everything was identical between all of the riders, so there wasn't any racing at all. So that brings us back to 2027. Will the bikes actually be slower? There's a high chance that they won't be. Currently, MotoGP bikes can have upwards of 300 brake horsepower, and even with the throttle wide open, the electronics won't let the bike deliver full power until around 4th gear. So in theory, the 850cc bikes will produce less power, but the bikes may then be able to get full power in 3rd gear rather than 4th. Although in 2027, they'll also be given one less engine per rider. So teams may have to make them more reliable and therefore even slower, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. I'm excited for the new changes in 2027, and fingers crossed the racing is going to be the best it's ever been. If you're interested to learn more about motorbike racing, click on this video here where I explain everything you need to know about Moto 2. Thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.